At the edge of the known galaxy, the Erebus station floated like a beacon of human ambition and innovation. Built over decades in a remote sector, far from any planetary interference, it symbolized a bold leap in scientific exploration. At the heart of its monumental structure lay the Quantum Nexus, a device as enigmatic as it was revolutionary, promised to be the key to exploring parallel universes. For many, it was the dawn of a new era. For others, a dangerous flirtation with forces that should remain undisturbed. Cale Rhine, a scientist from a species specialized in energy manipulation, observed the station with a mix of fascination and apprehension. He was one of the few who truly understood the catastrophic potential of meddling with the foundations of reality. Humans never cease to outdo themselves, he muttered to himself while analyzing the Nexus's preliminary data. His presence on Erebus was no coincidence. The Coalition had sent experts from various species to observe the experiment, but he knew his real role there was to be the voice of reason should something go wrong. The Nexus activation was such a highly anticipated event that humans and aliens crowded into the observation room. Screens displayed detailed images of the device, a pulsating energy structure suspended within a protective dome. Human scientists enthusiastically explained the revolutionary benefits it would bring, from portals to explore untapped resources to instant communication between galaxies. But while the crowd applauded, Cale noticed subtle signs that unsettled him. Irregular energy spikes, abnormal readings. He tried to alert a human technician nearby but was met with a confident smile. "Everything's under control," the technician assured him. Cale remained unconvinced. Eleanor Vance, the commander of Erebus, surveyed the room with sharp eyes. She was known for her firm leadership, but internally, she felt the weight of every decision. Inviting observers from so many species was a calculated risk but a necessary one. The success of the Nexus wasn't just about science. It was a statement that humanity deserved a prominent place in the Coalition. She locked eyes with Cale, who seemed on the verge of saying something, but before he could, a countdown began. There was no time left for doubts. When the Nexus was activated, the observation room fell into absolute silence. A bluish light radiated from the dome, passing through the reinforced windows. The device began to pulse, emitting a sound frequency that seemed to resonate in the back of everyone's minds. For a moment, everything proceeded as planned. Screens displayed stable graphs, and a murmur of awe rippled through the room. But then, Cale saw something that sent a chill down his spine. The energy patterns began oscillating violently. He rose abruptly. "Shut down the Nexus now," he shouted, his voice echoing across the room. Before anyone could react, a wave of energy erupted from the Nexus, sweeping through the station like silent thunder. Systems flickered, the screens went dark, and for a moment, everyone was plunged into darkness. Then, reality seemed to fold in on itself. A deep, almost living sound reverberated through the walls as the first anomalies began to appear. Tears in space emitting intense light and heat. When the emergency lights flickered on, Eleanor stood, trying to make sense of the chaos. Cale looked at her, his gaze intense. "This isn't just a malfunction," he said, his voice heavy with gravity. "It's the beginning of something much bigger." The energy wave that swept through the station left a trail of chaos. Alarms blared in every corridor as emergency lights bathed the environment in a pulsing red glow. Scientists and technicians scrambled frantically, trying to reboot critical systems. In the control center, Eleanor Vance held a communicator, striving to maintain order. "Damage reports now." Her voice was firm, but inside, she felt the weight of a decision that could determine the fate of everyone on board. The initial reports confirmed her worst fears. The anomalies were not mere malfunctions. They were spreading. Cale Rhine, now in the control room beside Eleanor, studied the data with a grim expression. "The quantum fluctuations are tearing holes in the fabric of space-time," he explained, pointing to the flickering monitors. "If this continues, we could be facing a dimensional cascade. It won't just be the station at risk, but potentially this entire sector of the galaxy." Eleanor looked at him, trying to process the gravity of his words. "And the only way to stop it?" Cale hesitated before answering. We need to stabilize the Nexus or destroy it. While the leaders deliberated, chaos consumed other parts of the station. Groups of alien diplomats were stranded in sectors where the anomalies were most intense. One of these distortions resembled a translucent bubble, floating mid-corridor. When a human scientist attempted to pass through it, they vanished instantly, leaving behind only a disturbing echo. "These things, they're not natural," commented an alien technician observing the scene. There was fear in his voice, but also an unsettling curiosity. Eleanor knew a quick decision was necessary. Calling for an emergency meeting, she gathered the station's top experts, including Kale, to devise a plan. The room was thick with tension, voices rising and fingers pointing. "You knew the risks. This technology should never have been activated," shouted a Zillion diplomat. Eleanor raised her hand, demanding silence. "Now is not the time for blame. We need solutions. Kale, what do you suggest?" Kale stood, all eyes on him. "The Nexus is out of control, but we can still access it manually. There's a chance we can stabilize the quantum fields, but it will be dangerous. We'll need to cross sectors of the station already heavily compromised by the anomalies." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. "And if we fail?" someone asked. Kale sighed. "Then we'll have to consider destroying the Nexus. But that also comes with immeasurable risks." Eleanor took charge. "We'll split our forces. I'll coordinate operations to ensure the most affected sectors are evacuated. Kale, you'll lead a team to the Nexus chamber to attempt stabilization. Choose your members and prepare to depart immediately." She scanned the room. "Remember, if we fail here, there won't be another chance." Kale quickly assembled his team. He chose Lucas, a human engineer specializing in energy systems, a multi-armed alien technician whose multitasking skills would be invaluable, and a Draken soldier, known for their strength and resilience. "This won't be an easy mission," Kale said, looking at each of them. "We'll need to trust each other if we're going to survive." Meanwhile, the anomalies continued to grow. In one of the station's farthest sectors, a group of alien diplomats was trapped when a distortion blocked the main corridor. The translucent bubbles began multiplying, creating a disturbing visual effect that defied spatial logic. Some reported hearing whispers emanating from within the anomalies, though sensors detected nothing. On their way to the Nexus, Kale and his team encountered the first signs of the collapse's true impact. Corridors that seemed infinite, as if space itself was bending. Entire sectors eerily silent, with sound absorbed by invisible forces. "This is worse than I imagined," Lucas remarked, adjusting a detection device. "If we don't stabilize this quickly, these distortions will consume the entire station." Reaching the final checkpoint before entering the Nexus sector, Kale paused to review the latest data. He knew time was running out, but something deeply unsettled him. The readings weren't just signs of instability. They seemed coordinated, as if something was trying to communicate through the collapse. He kept this to himself for now. There were more urgent matters to address. Eleanor, monitoring everything from afar, sent a final message over the communicator. "Good luck, Kale. The entire station is depending on you." He took a deep breath before responding. "We'll do our best." But deep down, he knew that their best might not be enough. The corridors of Erebus, once brightly lit and orderly, now resembled a maze distorted by shadows and flickering lights. Kale led his team at a brisk pace, his eyes constantly scanning the data on his portable scanner. Behind him, Lucas carried an improvised toolkit. The alien technician manipulated real-time sensors with multiple arms, and the Draken followed at the rear, his defensive posture signaling he was ready for any threat. The silence was unnerving. Only the sound of controlled breaths and the distant hum of the anomalies filled the air. "This way," Kale said, pointing to a corridor on the right. But as they turned the corner, they were met with a surreal sight. An anomaly floated mid-path, resembling a translucent sphere of light. Within it, indistinct images seemed to form and dissolve. "Don't get too close," the alien technician warned, adjusting his sensors. "That thing is emitting an unstable dimensional pattern. Could consume us in seconds." The team had to improvise a detour, navigating through a partially destroyed sector where metal plates and exposed cables made the terrain treacherous. As they walked, the Draken broke the silence. "Do you feel that?" His deep, serious voice carried weight. Kale paused, frowning. "Feel what?" The Draken hesitated before replying. "It's like something is watching us." Lucas laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's just the station's sensors malfunctioning. Nothing to worry about." But Kale knew it wasn't just that. He felt it too, though he didn't dare admit it. Soon after, the team arrived at a corridor where the lights flickered erratically. Kale checked his scanner and froze. "There's a large anomaly ahead. We can't bypass it." The alien technician quickly analyzed the data. "We can temporarily stabilize it with these devices," he suggested, pointing to the transmitters he carried. Kale nodded but warned, "This will give us only a few minutes. We need to move quickly." Setting up the devices was a nerve-wracking task. While the alien technician positioned the transmitters around the anomaly, Lucas and the Draken stood guard. Kale, on the other hand, monitored the energy fluctuations. When the containment field was activated, the anomaly seemed to contract, creating a narrow path for the team to pass through. "Will it hold?" Lucas asked, visibly tense. "If it doesn't, we'll find out soon enough," the alien technician replied dryly. The team hurried through the corridor, feeling the strange heat emanating from the anomaly. Just as they cleared it, the containment field began to fail, and the sphere of light expanded again, cutting off their way back. As they pressed on, the phenomena around them grew more intense. In one corridor, they encountered something deeply unsettling. A group of scientists and alien diplomats trapped in what appeared to be a temporal bubble. Their bodies were frozen mid-air, like statues, but their panicked expressions repeated in an endless loop. "This is what happens when someone gets caught in an anomaly like that," Kale explained in a low voice. "They're stuck between moments. We can't help them now." The sight shook the team, especially Lucas, who averted his gaze, trying to block out grim thoughts. As they neared the Nexus chamber, the device's pulsating hum grew louder, reverberating in their bones. The environment began to shift as well. The walls seemed distorted, as if made of liquid rippling with each pulse. "We're getting close," Kale said, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. But before they could reach the entrance, a new threat emerged. Distorted forms began to materialize from the anomalies. These figures were translucent, their outlines vibrating and disintegrating with each passing second. Their shapes defied logic, making it impossible to determine if they were solid or gaseous. "Creatures from the other side," Kale murmured. "They shouldn't be here." One of the entities advanced toward the team, moving hesitantly as if exploring its surroundings. The Draken raised his weapon and fired an energy pulse. The shot passed through the creature without causing any visible damage, but it seemed to irritate the being. It emitted a low, resonating sound that vibrated in everyone's minds, like a silent scream. "Run!" Kale shouted, as the team sprinted toward the Nexus entrance. The alien technician deployed devices to create temporary barriers, but he knew they wouldn't hold the creatures for long. Reaching the Nexus chamber, the team sealed the door behind them, isolating the creatures, at least for now. Everyone was breathing heavily, but Kale knew there was no time to rest. He turned to the Nexus, which pulsed violently at the center of the room, its protective dome now cracked and unstable. "This is the heart of the crisis," he said, more to himself than to the others. "We need to stabilize it, or everything will be lost." But as he analyzed the data on the control panel, something caught his attention. A familiar energy pattern, resembling an attempt at communication. Kale felt a chill run down his spine. "They're trying to talk to us," he murmured. Lucas, still catching his breath, looked at Kale in disbelief. "You mean those things? They're not just invaders?" Kale shook his head slowly. "I'm not sure, but one thing is clear. Whatever is on the other side knows we're here. And I don't know if that's good or bad." The Nexus chamber pulsed with a nearly living energy, filling the space with a deep hum that seemed to resonate in their very bones. At its center, the protective dome surrounding the device was severely cracked, with arcs of bluish energy escaping through the fissures, writhing in the air like electric serpents. Kale approached cautiously, while the rest of the team kept a safe distance, assessing the situation. "This is worse than I imagined," he murmured. His eyes locked on the panel's readings. "We're on the brink of total collapse." Lucas, his voice hesitant, asked, "If we manage to stabilize it, is there still a risk of more of those things showing up?" Before Kale could answer, the alien technician interjected, pointing at a monitor displaying unstable fluctuations. "No matter what we do, as long as the Nexus is active, we're vulnerable." Kale took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision ahead. He knew that the only way to ensure safety was to shut the Nexus down entirely, but doing so would mean losing the connection to the other universe, and with it, the greatest scientific breakthrough in history. Before they could discuss further, the creatures began to reappear. They seeped through the walls like liquid shadows, their distorted forms pulsing in time with the Nexus. The Draken, who had kept his weapon ready since they entered the chamber, was the first to react. He fired an energy pulse directly at one of the creatures, but the shot passed through it without causing any visible damage. "These things can't be defeated like this," he said, retreating slowly. "We need another plan." Kale quickly analyzed the data as the creatures advanced. He realized their appearances were directly tied to the Nexus's energy emissions. "They're being drawn to the energy field," he concluded. "If we reduce the Nexus's intensity, we might be able to push them back to where they came from." Lucas, visibly nervous, began adjusting the controls under Kale's guidance. But each adjustment seemed to agitate the creatures, which began emitting low, disturbing sounds, as if trying to communicate or warn them. The tension in the room peaked when one of the creatures lunged at the Draken. He instinctively used his strength to shove it away, but the impact sent him crashing into the wall. Lucas rushed to help, but the Draken waved him off. "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Do what needs to be done." His resolve gave the team the focus they needed to press on. Kale realized they couldn't simply stabilize the Nexus. They needed to find a way to isolate its emissions to prevent the creatures from continuing to emerge. "The core is overloaded," he explained, pointing at the panel. "If we can redirect the energy to the external conductors, we can create a temporary dimensional barrier. But it will require precise synchronization." The alien technician nodded. "I can set up the conductors, but I'll need time." As the technician worked, Lucas and Kale focused on keeping the creatures at bay. Using improvised energy field devices, they managed to delay the distorted form's advances. But each second felt like an eternity, and Kale knew they were at their limit. "Hurry!" he shouted as one of the creatures nearly breached their temporary barrier. "We're running out of time." Finally, the alien technician completed his setup. "It's ready," he announced. Kale rushed to the main panel and activated the energy redirection. The entire room was bathed in intense light as the creatures recoiled, emitting sounds that were almost like screams of frustration. One by one, they disappeared, pulled back into the anomalies that had brought them forth. The Nexus now pulsed more quietly, though a faint vibration lingered in the air. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Lucas collapsed to the floor, exhausted, while the Draken, visibly injured, managed to stand with the alien technician's help. Kale remained at the panel, analyzing the final readings. "We've stabilized it temporarily," he said, though his voice was heavy with concern. "But it's not enough. We need to shut down the Nexus completely before another breach forms." Eleanor's voice came through the communicator, urgent. "Kale, what's the status?" "Things are under control in other sectors for now. But we need a definitive solution." Kale hesitated before responding. "We can end this now, but destroying the Nexus means losing all the research and our connection to the other universe." Eleanor was silent for a moment before replying. "You're the one there. I trust your judgment." Kale looked at his team. Lucas was exhausted but resolute. The Draken, despite his injuries, nodded firmly, ready for whatever needed to be done. The alien technician, adjusting his sensors, spoke with unexpected pragmatism. "Sometimes, sacrificing the present is necessary to protect the future." Kale knew they were right. He placed his hands on the controls and initiated the shutdown sequence. As the Nexus's energy faded, the room began to stabilize. The cracks in the protective dome sealed themselves, and the pulsing hum gradually disappeared, leaving only the faint buzz of auxiliary systems. When the process was complete, Kale felt a mix of relief and emptiness. He knew the decision had saved lives, but had also closed the door on a promising chapter of scientific exploration. As the team began to recover, Kale reviewed the final data. What he found left him uneasy. A recurring pattern in the readings, like a coded message. They were trying to communicate, he said quietly. Lucas looked at him, confused. Who? Kale didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the now-dormant Nexus. We don't know enough, but someday, maybe we'll find out. The Nexus chamber was engulfed in absolute silence. Kale and his team stood motionless, trying to process what had just transpired. The device, once the pulsing heart of the Erebus station, was now inert, reduced to an offline structure enclosed within its reinforced dome. The emergency systems finally ceased their flashing alarms, and the station began to regain a semblance of stability. However, the repercussions of the event were far from resolved. Eleanor entered the chamber shortly after, accompanied by 2 human officers and an alien diplomat from the Coalition. Her expression was a mix of relief and concern. Reports indicate that the anomalies are disappearing, she said with a faint sigh. But I need to know. Is the Nexus secure? Kale, still reviewing the final data, responded without looking up. Secure isn't the right word. It's contained. But if something reactivates it, the cycle could start again. As Kale explained the technical details, the alien diplomat interrupted, his voice heavy with indignation. You toyed with forces you don't understand and put all of us in danger. This is an unforgivable recklessness. The diplomat's tone made Lucas clench his fists, but Kale raised a hand, signaling for calm. Yes, we made mistakes, he admitted. But if we hadn't acted as we did, you wouldn't be alive to make that accusation. The room fell silent for a moment. Eleanor stepped in, attempting to diffuse the tension. What happened here is a wake-up call for all of us, not just humans. The Nexus represents a scientific leap, but it also carries risks we need to better understand. Pointing fingers now won't get us anywhere. Her firm tone brought a measure of order to the conversation, though the atmosphere remained strained. Meanwhile, the damage across the station was being assessed. Many sectors were rendered unusable, and there were reports of alien diplomats demanding immediate transport back to their home planets. Some openly called for the Erebus station to be dismantled and interdimensional experiments permanently banned. Others, more cautious, argued that the research should continue but under stricter coalition oversight. Listening to these debates from afar, Kale felt the weight of his decision grow heavier. He knew the Nexus was more than just a machine. It was a turning point in the history of science. The alien technician who had worked alongside Kale during the crisis found him in one of the corridors as he headed toward the control room. You saved the station, he said pragmatically. But you know that won't be enough to appease the coalition. They'll want answers and guarantees. Kale nodded with a tired smile. I know. And those answers will decide whether Erebus has a future. The emotional toll of the crisis also began to surface. Lucas, still shaken by the events, approached Kale in a moment of privacy. I hesitated in there, he said, his voice trembling. If you hadn't been there, I wouldn't have been able to go on. Kale placed a reassuring hand on Lucas's shoulder. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Lucas. It's moving forward despite it. You did what needed to be done, and that's what matters. Kale's words brought some comfort to Lucas, though he knew the young engineer had a long road ahead to fully overcome the trauma. Meanwhile, the political debates on the station grew more intense. Zanari, the diplomat who had been one of Kale's harshest critics, sought him out for a more private conversation. I've been hard on you and your colleagues, he began, his tone more restrained this time. But I also recognize that without your actions, none of us would be alive. That said, the Nexus is a threat that cannot be ignored. Kale understood that Zanari's words were not just criticism but also an attempt to build consensus. I agree we need to be cautious, Kale replied. But abandoning this technology would waste its potential. The key is to learn from our mistakes. The discussions reached a climax when the coalition issued an official statement demanding a full report on the incident and the measures to prevent future crises. Eleanor, who had taken the lead in negotiations, summoned Kale for a meeting. "They're pushing for a quick decision," she explained. "But we need time to fully assess what happened." Kale agreed, though he knew time was a luxury they might not have. As the station tried to regain a sense of normalcy, Kale returned to the Nexus chamber, now sealed and monitored by enhanced security systems. He stood before the dormant structure, feeling a mix of sadness and curiosity. Despite everything, he still believed in the Nexus's potential. "This isn't the end," he said quietly, as if speaking directly to the machine. "There's still so much we don't understand." Across the galaxy, news of the incident at Erebus spread quickly. On some planets, the event was seen as a testament to human audacity. On others, it was interpreted as a dire warning. The future of the Nexus and of the station itself now depended not only on science but also on politics, diplomacy, and, above all, trust. The Nexus crisis reverberated across the galaxy. Official reports, rumors, and fragmented analyses spread rapidly among the coalition species, creating an unprecedented polarization. On many worlds, leaders demanded an immediate suspension of all interdimensional experiments, pointing to the Erebus incident as proof of humanity's recklessness. Others, more ambitious, saw the events as an opportunity to push scientific exploration further and perhaps establish contact with intelligences from other universes. On Erebus, tensions ran high. The station had survived, but it was far from recovering. Eleanor tirelessly coordinated repair operations while dealing with a flood of messages from the coalition and diplomats still aboard. Every word had to be carefully chosen. "If we lose their trust now," she told Kale during a meeting, "Erebus could be dismantled." And honestly, they might be right. Kale, though he understood her concerns, disagreed. "If we shut this door now, we may never find our way back." Meanwhile, heated debates took place in formal meetings and informal gatherings across the station. Diplomat Zanari, a vocal critic from the start, became the center of one such discussion. "We cannot ignore what happened here," he argued before a group of alien representatives. "But we must also admit that the Nexus represents a unique opportunity. The question is, are we ready to handle it?" His words sparked a range of reactions, some agreeing, others accusing him of supporting something far too dangerous. Kale, reluctant to engage in political debates, was summoned to a coalition meeting to present his findings. During his presentation, he displayed graphs and patterns collected during the Nexus collapse. "These data suggest that the creatures we encountered weren't merely invaders," he explained. "They were reacting to our presence, perhaps even trying to understand what we were doing. There's a possibility we were intruding into their territory, just as they intruded into ours." His explanation was met with silence, followed by a mix of intrigue and skepticism. "Are you suggesting these things are sentient?" asked one diplomat with a tone of disdain. Kale responded calmly, "I'm suggesting we don't know enough to make that claim or dismiss it. But ignoring the possibility would be irresponsible." Kale's words marked a turning point. Some began to consider that the Nexus was not just a machine but a bridge to something greater, something that demanded care and responsibility. As the debates continued, the emotional impacts of the event began to surface more deeply. Lucas, after days of introspection, approached Kale. I'm not sure I belong in this line of work," he confessed. "What happened in there made me realize how much we're dealing with forces we barely understand." Kale, though saddened by the possibility of Lucas leaving, understood. "Exploring the unknown is never easy," he said. "But if you choose another path, take what you've learned here with you. That's what makes us better." Lucas thanked him, promising to carefully consider his decision. The Draken, on the other hand, remained steadfast in his resolve. During a conversation with Kale, he expressed something that surprised the scientist. "My species is trained to face threats, but what we saw in there, that wasn't just a threat. It was something we've never faced before. I want to stay here because I know that when it happens again, we'll need to be ready." His determination inspired Kale, who felt the weight of his own doubts begin to lift. After weeks of deliberation, the coalition issued an official statement. Erebus would be allowed to continue operating, but under strict conditions. The Nexus would remain deactivated until a scientific and diplomatic commission completed a thorough investigation of the events. Furthermore, any attempt to reactivate the device would require unanimous approval from the coalition. For many, it was a partial victory. For Kale, it was a second chance. Back on the station, Eleanor gathered her core team to discuss the future. "We have their trust for now," she said. "But any mistake from here on will be the last. We need to prove we can handle this responsibility." Kale agreed, but something in his expression suggested he was already thinking beyond. To him, the Nexus wasn't just a risk or a scientific project. It was an invitation to explore the unknown, to push the boundaries of what was possible. Before ending the meeting, Eleanor asked, "Do you think we'll be ready when the time comes?" Kale gave a faint smile. "We'll never be completely ready. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." As the station's lights dimmed for the night cycle, Kale returned to the Nexus chamber, now sealed and heavily monitored. He placed his hand on the cold dome enclosing the device, feeling a strange connection to the machine. One day, he said to himself, "we'll understand what's on the other side. And when that day comes, I hope we're ready to listen." Erebus now seemed peaceful, slowly orbiting in an isolated sector of the galaxy. Yet beneath this apparent calm, the station was alive with activity. Scientists, technicians, and diplomats continued to process the impact of the Nexus incident as structural repairs progressed. Every damaged sector was gradually being restored, but the invisible scars of that event would remain for a long time. Kale stood by the window in his cabin, gazing out into space, his thoughts a mix of relief and unease. The decision to shut down the Nexus had saved the station, but it had also raised more questions than answers. He wondered whether they had abandoned something that could have revolutionized the galaxy's understanding, or if, in doing so, they had avoided an even greater disaster. To him, the Nexus was more than a machine. It was an unfulfilled promise, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. Eleanor, ever pragmatic, found Kale shortly after. "The reports have been sent to the coalition," she said, sitting beside him. "They acknowledged what we accomplished, but now we're under a microscope. We'll need concrete proof that Erebus can operate safely." Kale nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. "The issue isn't just about safety," he replied. "It's about how we prepare for the unknown. We can't avoid what we don't understand forever." The two sat in silence for a moment, watching the star-filled void. Eleanor finally broke the quiet. "Do you believe they were trying to communicate? The creatures?" Kale turned to her, his expression a mix of uncertainty and fascination. "I do. The readings showed patterns, not randomness. But what they were trying to say, that's still a mystery." Eleanor crossed her arms, thoughtful. "If we decide to listen, will we be ready to accept what we hear?" As Erebus worked to resume normal operations, Lucas decided it was time to leave. "I need some time away from this," he told Kale as he packed his belongings. "But I think, in the future, I'll look back on this as a moment that shaped me." Kale shook his hand, respecting his decision. "You were part of the reason we're alive today. Never forget that." Lucas smiled for the first time in days before departing. The Draken, in contrast, became a constant presence on Erebus. No longer just a soldier, he was now a fervent advocate for the Nexus's importance. "Those things we faced," he told Kale during a patrol, "weren't enemies. They were enigmas, and that's what makes this station important. We're here to face them again when the time comes." His perspective mirrored Kale's, reinforcing the idea that, despite the risks, the Nexus still had a vital role to play. The coalition officially announced that Erebus would remain operational, though under strict supervision. The Nexus, however, would remain sealed until its dangers and potential were fully understood. For Kale, this was both a victory and a defeat. He knew the work was far from over. Before the start of a new cycle on the station, Kale returned to the Nexus chamber, now surrounded by layers of security. He stood before the dome encasing the device, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired. "It's not over yet," he said quietly, as if speaking directly to the machine. "One day we'll come back here, but next time we'll be ready." As Kale left the chamber, the lights around Erebus began to glow with renewed strength, illuminating the void of space. To him, the future was as vast and uncertain as the universe he observed. Yet even in the face of the unknown, there was something that kept him grounded. The conviction that exploring, learning, and daring were integral to what made life meaningful. And as Erebus continued its orbit, a faint oscillation in the Nexus, imperceptible to any sensor, left one final enigma lingering in the air. Whatever lay on the other side might still be waiting.